All right, and we are recording. All right, Mr. Boobles, kick us off, man.
All right, so we have Maneesh back on the Agile Wire this week. So last time, Maneesh, we had our retro after we got done recording, and we're like, oh, I wish I would have told this story. I wish I would have told this story, and we're like, well, let's just have another conversation. Let's bring it back, and we'll do it another time. So that's this time, and I know we were talking about this bank that you helped back over in Ireland, and they're a huge bank, and we wanted to dive into organizational agility. What does it take to be successful, and tell some stories around that. So maybe you could kick us off there, Manish, and tell us about that bank.
So Jeff, thank you both for having me on. I really appreciate it. It was a really great conversation, and I've really enjoyed and reflected on it as well. So glad to be back. I think one of the things that, to your point, that just stuck with me was we talk so much about what it takes, and we talked a lot about cultural experiences and diversity, as well as the 10,000-hour rule, and there were a lot of pieces and nuggets in there. But one thing just stuck with me was, can we talk about some real examples to share? Because as I've worked with a lot of people, those examples really make it visual and resonates with people. So I thought maybe we could take a step back and just shoot some stories across the board. I can talk about the bank and a few other things, but also hear from you on what's working in those contexts, right? And organizational agility, but even just agile in general, as you all work today. So just taking a step back, I think what organizational agility means for me is something I just wanted to sort of step back and ground myself on as well. There are 5 essential tenets that I step back to and really focus on. One is, the backbone of an organization. So when you go on an agile transformation, a digital transformation, why are you doing this? What is your core reason for it? What's the value? What's the outcome? Where do you see that vision in the next few years, months, weeks, whatever you embark on, right? That clear North Star. Do you have one, right? And I know McKinsey talks about this a lot in the context of, you have to have agility in an organization, but you have to have a stable backbone as well. Understanding what you're looking to do, because that stable backbone will help you be agile around it, that anchor, essentially. The second piece is having empowered teams. So really that empowered organism that, the Scrum team, but also beyond that, any team that is able to really move and get what they need to do to fulfill that purpose and drive towards that outcome. The third thing is, while you're trying to drive towards that outcome, do you have those feedback cycles, those feedback loops that are iterative and that are areas that you can actually reflect on, refine, and move forward? The fourth piece is passionate, dynamic people who really value the work they do and are connected to the purpose and connected to the outcome, and feel empowered and feel supported in teams. And the last thing is radical transparency. So being as transparent as possible and using that transparency to drive the ball forward, to move the organization's purpose forward. Using it less for politics and using it more to support a team and support a unit together. So always think about those 5 tenets to really drive organizational agility. And that's why I reflected on this bank in Ireland. So it's Allied Irish Bank. And while I was at ThoughtWorks, it was a fantastic story with my team there. The bank has been around for several decades. It's a great organization, great people. Nothing had really changed in Ireland for about 60, 70, 80 years in banking, right? You have the tellers, you have the branches. Ireland, people tend to go to the branches. This was a few years ago, and that continues to be just part of how the culture is, right? It's not the digital mobile banking experience as you'd expect before. So they didn't really need to change until an organization called N26, which is a bank based out of Germany, just started up. They're a huge bank now based in the US and Germany and other parts of Europe as well. Essentially decided to test and validate their concepts in Ireland. I think the story goes that if it worked out, it's well and good. They got some feedback out of that digital mobile banking experience. If it doesn't, hey, it's Ireland. It's not our core country of focus. We can take all those learnings and just come back to Germany and run with it. And they started to take away market share from AIB and other banks as well. And it moved from, having a pretty significant market share over the years and decades that they've been around to starting to lose it and not knowing why, because it wasn't another bank in Ireland that was pulling this off. And they really had to get to this backbone of, okay, we need to understand this. We need to change our ways of working. We need to bring a whole new model of thinking. We need to be quite disruptive in the world that we live in because there's uncertainty now on, how can we even do this? And we need to do this quite quickly. And that's where the stable backbone of that purpose started to really come together. Identifying, okay, so what does it mean to be digital? Why is N26 taking away this market share from us? What is the clear differentiator between us and them? Do we want to be that? Do we want to play in that space? Right? And really getting that leadership team to think through that, driving towards a clear vision over the next 2-3 years of where they wanted to be, and being razor focused on that as they move forward. So that was a really interesting conundrum for them. And they asked us to help them on their journey because they didn't have the internal empowered team mindset because they had a different way of working before. And moving to this new way of working, they wanted to just seed that new mindset and that new culture as they went along. Over time, Agile was new to them as well. They had not worked in sprints before, so the whole foundation of the annual funding models and so on that you see in lots of organizations, they just had to deal with. So all of that was very different for them. And they started to work in these sprints, and they thought they'd probably deliver something in 5, 7, 9 years in terms of their first mobile app. And fortunately, it just showed them that you bring an empowered team together, you take a lot of their constraints out of the way, give them a clear purpose on what you're looking to build, right? And you don't try to solve everything all at once. They got their first product out in 6 months.
So I really like this story because even thus far, the whole first half, you could have just replaced the word AIG with just about any large company out there over the past few years, right?
AIB, yeah.
Or yeah, excuse me. What was interesting though was what precipitated that change, right? Was the threat. And what I thought was interesting here was that it was a real threat instead of a perceived threat. Like I think Jeff and I have talked about this in the past, but like that's the impetus that so many organizations are missing. And until they feel that, until it's a real threat out there, a lot of our larger organizations are pretty complacent. They're okay with the status quo. They don't feel the sense of urgency or the desire to change until that threat comes down the pipeline to really kind of nudge them out in this direction here to start thinking about what's a different way to be going after this.
I was going to say, unfortunately, I think most of the times that backbone that you're talking about is a threat. It's not an opportunity. And when it is an opportunity, I sometimes see organizations that don't maybe rally around it as closely as they do a threat. And I sometimes wonder if that could, if it is an opportunity, if there was more entrepreneurial spirit, if there was more, I don't know, capitalists inside the organization, as Gary Hamel would put it, if that would change and that you could be more proactive and that backbone could be more based on opportunities than threats. I don't know. What are your thoughts on something like that? Or have you seen many backbones based on opportunities? Because I haven't seen that many of them. And the ones I've seen, it seems hard to get everybody aligned around that.
Yeah, I'll talk to one about an opportunity. I think one of the nuggets that was super interesting for me in the context of AIB was they had these nuggets of the backbone creating an incentive for the whole organization to rally together. And sometimes backbones are not healthy, right? If you don't have if your backbone is all about agendas and not about agendas for it's more about your personal agenda rather than the agenda of the organization. That backbone is really can hurt you in the context of what you're trying to do. So I think they had the nuggets of the backbone. They had the nuggets and empowered team. Someone called out, hey, we need to do something about this, right? They had the backbone of the power iterative loop because they had a view where somebody was looking at the market share and the disruption that was around them, and they were not myopic in that world. There were dynamic people who were able to voice that and make that happen, and there was transparency around doing something about it, which I think I was really interesting to see that, hey, we don't have the tools ourselves. Let's bring those tools from somewhere else and change who we need to be. I thought that was really powerful. Have you seen that, whether it's opportunity or threat, where someone from the inside is trying to do something but just unable to unleash that from within the organization?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen it where maybe, there was a perceived threat at one point, but then it's like, yeah, there really isn't one, and people weren't really aligned around it, and there really wasn't like a catalyst for change, right?
Yeah.
I've seen it where, to your point, where, certain organizations, maybe it was a checkbox that somebody had and said, hey, I need to do this to, get that next promotion and or something. I need to lead a major, organizational change. And people didn't get behind that either, So I do agree that, you have to find something that many people can get behind and there's a greater purpose.
Yeah.
And if you have that, I think people, will support whatever that change is,
Yeah.
From a training perspective, I was just going to add real quick. You called out, feedback loops, passionate people, radical transparency, and empowered teams. And the backbone, obviously. But what I would typically see is the lack of empowered teams. We've got passionate people who want to be part of the change, but they can't get the change going because they're not necessarily empowered, or they're empowered in this area over here, but they're not necessarily empowered to take it to the next level, right? And we talked quite a bit about those guardrails last time, right? It's like, oftentimes, in particular with Scrum Masters, when I'm going through training with Scrum Masters, that's where the frustration point is at, where they're told to just go work with the teams, right? Just stay down there and work with the teams. And I don't want to be a Debbie Downer with this, but that's where I feel like there's pushback to those guardrails. And going back to the last conversation, we just the leaders haven't yet gotten to the point to realize, over time I need to start extending these out, or we're going to start to have a disconnect between the amount of autonomy that we're giving to people and the amount of mastery that they're displaying. And when we see that disconnect, there's frustration there from a people perspective.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that's been one of the big challenges, is like when you don't have the champion leaders who are rallying the people who are trying to drive the change. We're not creating those like mini pieces of momentum to help get through it. Those people, they go away sometimes. They leave and they try to go find the next mountain to climb, because that's what they are. They are the dynamic, passionate people who are really want to do something with their lives, right? And drive impact. So that's absolutely something that I tend to see often. It's to your point on the opportunity versus threat, right? So this was absolutely a threat, and what it did was this threat created a new organization and new opportunities, and really took them leaps and bounds into where they are today. So I think in the first year, 18 months, 60% of their traffic moved to a digital mobile online presence, just because they started to see the momentum. They jumped on it, the market moved with them, and they unlocked at the right time, right? And now they are market leaders on the online mobile side of digital banking, which is a fantastic story. On the flip side, this is one of my favorite stories on the side of opportunity. There was an interesting group in Scotland. I've spent a lot of time in Europe, which is where I have some of these stories. In Scotland, where it was a small project. It was a project with a university, and they have basically decided about a few years ago that IoT was the big leap forward in agri-farming, and particularly in herding cows. They called it's called silent herdsmen. And essentially the goal for the organization was to use a Fitbit tracking system, in essence, for cows. Because the weather in Scotland most of the year is terrible. Herding cows is really difficult. And then managing those cows is super hard in those months, right? So how do you use a digital way to disrupt this entire industry back to front? And a professor in one of the universities close by had come up with a patent to essentially test out a Fitbit-like thing you put around the neck of a cow. And based on their movements, you can tell if a cow is well, unwell, breeding, etc. Super interesting, right? How do you use an agile digital transformation in this context? Because people who are working in this sort of industry are working at all kinds of tools and systems and in all kinds of dirt, literally, where they can't use these digital systems. You can't just give them an iPad and say, walk the streets, and you have offline access issues and so on and so forth. Right? But the backbone and the purpose, again, was very strong. It was like, we want to disrupt this. This can't be how, we're in the 2020s, right? We can't be in this world where this is the way agri-farming is set up. And essentially, they had that clear backbone. The team that was set up was did a lot of testing in the field, literally, to understand how these things play out. And they used cloud. They use statistics in the cloud to really now start to farm not only from that one farm, but across 100 farms across the UK, to start to really make that drive momentum across the whole industry. And it helped them scale up. They got to 400 farms over time. And it was a true transformation of not just that one farm, one project, one goal, truly an opportunity. And now the entire European farming system has changed, agri-farming system has changed on the back of this. So truly, to your point, an opportunity that drove that purpose and that expands that purpose across the board.
I don't
awesome.
know if this is literally the story that you're talking to, but it reminds me of something from, once again, man, this book has come up a few times now recently, but Thank You for Being Late. It talks specifically about that a story very similar to that, where they started keeping track of cattle, and through just basic tracking, they found out like the best times to milk the cattle, the best times for mating the cattle, et cetera. All of these exponential increases just from little data like that, and it almost makes me think that's likely a story that got wrapped into there. In really like cool story. Like I would never think of like cows, right? Like that's not where my
exactly,
when I think of agile mindset, it doesn't go to cattle. But I think that's also just kind of reinforcing that this. Now I don't want to sound religious when I say this, but like it is bigger than just how we develop products, right? Like I think that's how we approach it right now. But this goes to like what so many people say, like it is really a mindset, right? Small batch delivery, minimizing time to market. How can we reapproach how we're doing so many of the things that we're doing today, whether that's working with cattle or developing a product in a financial space, right? The tenets that you were talking about, the principles of agility, they still apply, and they can be used in many different domains that we're thinking about.
Yeah, I just think that the leadership is a key piece in all of these things that continues for me to resonate across. Because if you're not, to your point, any industry, any construct, you can use the agile principles, but how you apply them, you need really strong leadership, to that supportive leadership for those things to come through. And where I've seen a lot of these agile transformations or organizational agility initiatives fail is when it's a checkbox exercise, when leaders are not empowering. They are blaming. It's like it's a culture of politics and so on and so forth, and that makes it really difficult. And I've realized that in my experience over the last several years, that continues to play true in my life as well. If I feel that the political agendas or just general, the backbone is not clear, and the backbone is about something else, I tend to find it very difficult. And I'm guessing that that's where the Agile movement has become such a important piece for all of us, because that empowered, particularly in the world we live in today, and the last 6 months tells us that there's so much impact I think people want to make, and you never know what's going to happen to that point. Like, I think it'll be interesting to step back, and all the organizations that are not doing as well right now, did they have a clear backbone? Did they have the empowered teams? Did they have the culture to support? Did they have those people who were able to call out and champion and drive that change? It's interesting to see if there's a way to connect those dots.
Yeah, probably not, right? Like, the ones that are struggling are probably missing those things. And then now, because they can't see it, know what's going on, they probably squeeze tighter and try to control more, which then leads to less innovation, less creativity, and which leads to, more, soul crippling, work out there.
Yeah. Which, to your point on the opportunity versus threat, I think it's a two-sided coin to some extent. Sometimes, and a lot of people will probably see it on the threat side at this point.
I was just going to say, I think if you're doing something cutting edge like that, really easy to get behind it, right? Like, that's like, oh man, this work is really difficult. No one wants to do it. We can make work much better for these people. There was a project that I worked on a number of years ago that was kind of like that. And at first I was worried, like, oh, people are going to think like, oh, we're taking their job and they're not going to want to be supportive as the users. But there's more than enough work, and they could see the ROI that would come from it. And they're like, I can't believe we're doing it this way yet. And they were all on board. So, that fear never materialized. But I think it could in certain cases if, people felt threatened, like they were going to lose their jobs, or they were, especially in a time like this where it's like, what happens if you lose your job? And I don't know if I can find another one, depending on your skill sets and stuff like that. I could see people being very protective of their turf. And I've even seen that at some clients recently where, some people are a little more protective of their turf, and things that you normally wouldn't see start to happen because there is that, I think it is a root cause of there being fear there. And if you don't have that backbone, if you don't have that good leadership, people become complacent with managing dependencies instead of just getting rid of them and figuring out what an optimal way of working is. They're like, we can just manage it. It'll be fine. It's like, yeah, but we could get rid of it if we just made this change. But, they're afraid to take that step.
So we've been talking quite a bit over the past few episodes about leadership, and just a lot of the Gary Hamel quotes are popping into mind, but also Daryl. And so just imagine, we all jump into the DeLorean, hit 88 miles per hour, and maybe go back 10 years ago, back to your consultant days. It wasn't too long ago, actually. So maybe like 3 to 5 years ago. So you're stepping into an organization, and you see that maybe the leadership isn't quite bought in. Maybe they're lacking this backbone, or, this agile stuff, it's just a fad. It's going to go away in a few years. Like, what would your approach be to initiating that conversation? What are you trying to do to get buy-in with them that this is worth doing?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's something that, we talk about start with why a lot, right? And a lot of organizations don't start with why. They just go into the how. And the how of transformation is generally agile teams and setting teams up and getting them to run, some agile process, right? And then when you step back a few years later and you ask, so what were you trying to do this for? The question generally is not answered or not articulated very clearly. And I tend to see that more often than not, particularly when a transformation is in the midst of something. So a lot of there's two routes, right? There's one route of, my transformation is not working. What are we doing wrong? And so there's another model of, like, how do I even start? What do I do? Right? And both the answers are somewhat similar in my opinion, and love to hear yours as well, in the context of the why. So what I've tended to do with some of the leaders is just write a memo. Just tell me the story of 3 to 5 years from now.
Mm-hmm.
How will this change? How will this create and affect the change you are looking for? What does that look like for you? And don't do it in a HBR cover kind of way as you would in a workshop, but tell me the story that you would tell your colleague. Tell me the story that you would tell someone who's talking to you in the bar. What are you trying to do? Because the HBR story is a bloviated story, and we do it in workshops all the time, right? The cover story on these magazines. But actually, take me on this journey with you. Help me understand this journey. And it's much harder than you might expect.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially, a recent organization I was working at a large insurance company. They were merging two different parts of their business, and the why wasn't clear, in essence. And we went back to just write down that story, and then let's start articulating how will you measure that you're moving those things forward. And it was really hard. We did about 5 to 10 turns of that story over the few weeks we worked together. And we tested it with the teams, and then started to articulate clear results for each of those components. And that's where their OKRs and their objectives and key results were born. And that's what I've tended to really pull and step back to. One thing that tends to happen is those leaders tend to have to set up many objectives and many key results because that's what the organization expects of them. And we kept going back to, so give me the 3 that matter. Give me the 5 that matter. And then that really starts to shape the organization into something they can walk to. And that's where the OKR construct for me is super powerful, because it doesn't lock you in for on something that is too myopic. And it's something that is still clear and articulate that you can actually take people on that journey. And that's what that leader did. And over the next year, the organization just started to rally. The culture of the organization changed. Everybody on the floor could talk about what they were trying to do. And it was truly that transparency through the work that people were doing, and the intent was very clear. So that's what I would tend to do.
So I really like that story. Let me just quickly parrot it back to you, and then I'll shut up and let Jeff ask his question. So I heard you write the story, and what immediately came to mind, and I kick myself because I forget to do it so damn often. But like Amazon's press release, right? Like before they get started with something, they're thinking about that end in mind. What are the customers going to be raving about with our in a positive way? What is the reviews going to be like? And that sets their North Star. And I really liked your just, well then, what are the things that we have to be doing right now in order to start getting there? What are the 3 most important things that we need to be doing right now to be making progress on that? And that's just a nice, very smooth transition right into your OKRs right there. And you said, well, then how would we measure that we're going against this? And even if somebody doesn't even care about OKRs, great, you're getting what you need from it by driving the discussion or having the alignment, et cetera. So I really like the way that you articulated that. Sorry, Jeff, you were going to chime in with something though.
Yeah. Oh, I like the Amazon thing where you were going with that. So I'll dive on a little tangent there. I forget where I heard this recently, but somebody was telling me the story of how to promote empowerment. If you said yes to something when somebody that reported to you asked you for approval for something or to do something, great, awesome, you said yes to it. But when you said no, you had to write up a 2-page, I think it was actually Gary, maybe Gary Hamill told us this not too long ago. You had to write up a 2-page article of why you said no and explain the situation and post it on the company intranets for everybody to see. So there had to be a good reason to say no to something and not let somebody run with an idea that they have, right? And so I thought, well, that's kind of very similar to the Amazon thing. Like that's a cool way to just add some empowerment, right? Like you have to really have a good reason, and you have to be able to support it within your organization, or you're not going to have merit very long if you post stuff that just doesn't make a lot of sense. But I guess to answer Jeff's original question about the DeLorean, and we're going back in time, and what do you do? I don't know. I had a couple different thoughts, and my first one was like, well, I would probably start with leaders and whoever is running that area and say, what scares you? What scares the shit out of you? And like start there, because that's probably our threat, right? And then like what makes you really excited? Like what is the thing that just like you can't start talking about and you're just like bubbling about when we have to talk about an opportunity coming.
Yeah.
If we can figure out what those two things are, and maybe we can mitigate risk by frequent delivery and giving you transparency, and then we can get you really excited because we're actually learning faster. Just start delivering and giving that transparency. And I think that's what I would work with a team to do. Now, it would be different than, can you get support for them all to be on one team together, and not be split and that kind of stuff, depending on what kind of support you have. But I think that's where I would try to start and then see where you can get from there.
I think it is quite fascinating that your point on like talking to the teams. And on that storytelling we talked about, one of the biggest unlocks for those leaders has been testing their story with the teams and just getting to and listening to the feedback and actually doing something with the feedback, right? I think in the context of like, hey, that story doesn't resonate. I actually don't see what's in it for me. How will this really affect our team, our organization, our line of business? Will this really, move the needle on what we're trying to do as an organization? I think it's been a key aspect of empowerment, because people feel heard and then they actually want to be part of that movement. They believe in the movement. They feel like they've done something to drive it and then be part of it. What does empowerment mean to you? It's been an interesting question for me over the last few months.
Jeff, you want to take this one?
I would love to take that one, Jeff. Thank you for tossing it over to me. But no, I think that's an interesting question. Like, I think when people talk about empowerment, I hate using the analogy, but I think it's, what is it? Congress's definition of porn is you know it when you see it or something like that. But like, I kind of feel like that's empowerment. Like you know what it is like when it's missing. You know what command and control feels like. You know what frustration it feels like when you're not allowed to do the things that you feel like you should be allowed to do. But I don't know how to necessarily talk about it in the positive. And what I find interesting about your question is it might be related to even some of the issues that I'm running into right now, where it's less about autonomy or empowerment and more about not understanding where the guardrails are. So I mentioned earlier I took on a role at Health Champion. I'm the product owner there, but we also have I can't remember what her official title is. Technically, she's my boss, but she's a great lady. Enjoy working with her, but she's more like a director of product. So she kind of sits one level up. And how we've talked about our relationship there is I think about her as she's the excavator 100 yards in front of us, and she's digging a lot of holes, and she's trying to figure out which hole has oil in it. And if she thinks she's found one that's got a good amount of oil in it, then she says, "Hey, Jeff, come over here. I've got this idea. I think down here we've got a lot of oil, a lot of potential right here. I'm going to keep going. You dive into that and see if we can start getting some oil out of this thing, right?" And so then I step in and I kind of sit back, take a look at all the things that we want to do, start coming up with the experiments that I think we should be running to validate we're getting the return on investment and all that jazz coming out of there. But right now, I don't have a clear kind of line in the sand for where does her role kind of take over versus where does my role kind of take over. And to me, that while it isn't explicit, I feel like I don't have the autonomy that I should have because I'm not clear about where those guardrails are with her. And so I know I did a piss poor job of explaining like what does it mean to me, but like I think through that story you might be able to tell like I know it when I don't have it, but it's not necessarily anybody stepping in and telling me or disempowering me, right?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think that one of the things that there's some positives there, right? Because there's gray area in your oil discovery example. There's a gray area around, is that the right place to look for oil? Which I think you're not empowered to be part of that oil discovery analysis process. And then she's letting you get into a place where you're tending to go and look for it, but you might not know the parameters you're looking at. And I think that is actually fairly typical in terms of a lack of empowerment construct. I empower you to go look at that area. Is a lot of ways is how I've seen many leaders think about work. I empower you to think about that problem.
Sure.
And I think that that's something that a lot of the teams I've been working with have been wrestling with as well. What about you, Jeff? Yeah.
I think when I think of empowerment, I definitely think of decisions. And a guiding principle, maybe an organizational agility, would be favor decisions by many over decisions by few. And what I mean by that is we all know, the principles we live by within the organization. We know what's important. We know where we're going from a strategic standpoint. And so when stuff happens, I can make decisions, and there's not going to be, huge consequences if somebody would have did it maybe a little differently than me. I'm empowered to do that. That's one thing. But I think to Jeff's point, like, maybe he's not empowered to find those opportunities, or maybe even in your story with the bank in Ireland, maybe they weren't empowered to come up with that strategy of how they're going to go digital. It sounded like, like it wasn't open strategy is what we were talking about. And that's okay. But maybe they were empowered to do the technical, like, how do we actually do this? How do we actually create a banking solution that we could deliver to the market, in less than 7 years, like that they put out there? How fast could we do it? Like, they were empowered to solve that problem, which is awesome. And I think there are different guardrails. I think there's different spectrum of where that empowerment lies. And sometimes just getting to the empowerment to figure out how to do the work from a technical standpoint, some people have been controlled so much and there's been so much micromanagement that, that's a huge step. And people are just like, this is awesome, but it can go very far. It can go all the way up to like everything in the company. To some of Gary Hamel's stories that he had before, like the, GE plant that, one manager or one plant manager and 350 employees, right? Like, things like that. And they're all coming up with our complete open strategy in certain organizations and things like that, right? So I think those are all options. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's a spectrum of empowerment. And a lot of times when Jeff and I are talking about different, we're talking about like self-organization, because that comes up a lot, and I think that links very closely to empowerment. Self-organization, I think of that around how we do the work. I think about team self-selection, which is another level up, not required, but it's a great step forward where the teams get to pick who they work with, what they work on. And then there's like self-management where it gets into more like, hey, HR responsibility, strategy, budgets, like we have a lot more control in that area and we're a part of all those decisions. And that's a whole nother level. And so I think we can talk about empowerment all across that spectrum.
Sorry, two things real quick. One, like we've name dropped him like 7 times, and it's just because we literally just recorded like last week with him. So it's not like we're trying to just overkill the fact that, hey, we got to talk with Gary. No, just wanted to throw that out there. But the other more important thing was really quick. Like I think from all of these stories, and Jeff, you were kind of hitting this at the end, like just because there's a guardrail there doesn't mean you're not empowered. Like in your story about the, AIB going for digital first, or however they phrase that, like that was still a guardrail, but that didn't mean like, oh, all of a sudden we've disempowered all the teams and now they're just being micromanaged. No, there's still a whole lot of autonomy that we can bring in there, and empowerment we can bring there. So kind of in line with my story, like I'm super empowered. There's just this one area where I'm like, it kind of feels really weird. And like, I haven't overcome that yet. And because of that, I'm feeling like that's where my empowerment is lacking. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. That just might be where the guardrail is. We just haven't figured that out yet.
And that's spot on what I was going to say next, which is, I think a backbone or the iterative feedback loops and so on, you have some data that you're generally working with, and that's very like clearly you can actually measure it, monitor it hopefully most times. Empowerment is not a tangible thing, and it's essentially as teams go through that norming, forming, storming, performing, they understand their own guardrails, their personal guardrails, and what they are looking to do. Like a whole thing about like as teams learn about what their domain is, they improve. So it's good to have teams that are together for a long time, and they feel empowered to trust one another. It's not a very clear guardrail. And I think that's your point you're making, Jeff, as well, which is like you're still figuring out the boundaries before the oil, the discovery of the oil to actually the delivery of the oil, and running that through into it.
And my suggestion for Jeff or anyone in Jeff's situation, because I've been in that situation too, when you have new leaders that come in, is, I don't know, try something like delegation poker with that person and be like, here's a scenario, here's where I would put it, and this is how I think we should handle it. And then where would you put it, And like, maybe you're completely off, or just, make them answer first and then you tell them why, you think it's different. And then see where you're different. And then, you're doing this through scenarios instead of like real life, like something that, causes a conflict. And then when there is a conflict that comes up, be like, remember we talked about that scenario? We said this, isn't that close to this? And then here's why it's different. And you have a language to talk about guardrails with.
So it's really funny that you brought that up. So Tanya, my niece, just started working again. Her school is opening up, so she's going into work 2 days a week. I was literally on the road this before coming and recording, and I was thinking about this literal problem that I'm encountering. And I thought, you know what I should do? I should just do delegation poker. I'll set it up, and we could do it virtually on a board. We'll say, all right, what do you think this would be? I'll put something there, and then we can just show it, like a really simple scenario. But yeah, it looks like you read my mind, Jeff. That's exactly what I was thinking. Like, how can we even virtually build alignment around what we feel like this is? Is it a tell? Is it a sell? Is it advise? Whatever that might be, but a great tactical way of going out and building that alignment with whoever you're working with. And that can be a manager and a team member. That can be just two team members. Doesn't really matter, but a great tactical way of doing that.
Mm-hmm. And the hard thing about guardrails, because I don't know if, we say guardrail just flippantly, and boundaries, right? But they're different in context, and they're different for every single person, and they change all the time based off of frequent delivery, transparency, situations, and so like
risks you can take, yeah.
Exactly. And so having that open conversation is probably the easiest way to get alignment on that, with multiple scenarios. At least that's what I found.
One place I saw, one example around where I saw, like you said, you can see empowerment when it works. One place I saw where it didn't work is I was with this consulting firm. I was advising another consulting firm that was delivering product. And they initially thought this product was going to be delivered in 6 months with an 8-person team. 4 years, 200 people later, I joined that team, and it was really interesting because the team was not empowered, because the leadership didn't trust the team anymore. The team used to commit to work, but didn't really feel like they had the safety to commit. So they always went into this under-commit, over-deliver model. How they validate their own velocity and how they work, they had like loopholes central. And essentially the dialogue was, there was dialogue between the leadership and the team, but it was not transparent. So there was velocity, there was transparency, there was work was getting done. People were, going through their iterative loops, but nothing was moving in essence. And what we realized was the team was just, there was no safety. The team didn't feel empowered. The safety dropped significantly. So everything had been normalized to make sure that there were no feathers that were ruffled. And we essentially had to create a bit of a translation between both leadership and the client team to reduce some of the transparency from what was going from the leaders into the team, to repurpose how they were talking to the team. Like if something was, I don't know, X points, 5 points on one story, this was as bad as it was in that team. And the next iteration, they called out that same thing was maybe 10 points. The question was, why did you, call this, say this was 5 points and you found 6 bugs on it, so you undercommitted the last time. And it got to that point where the team just didn't feel like they were supported. And over time, leadership just had to change how they had those conversations, because they were trying to learn, but how they were coming across was command and control and not really effective. Mm-hmm. And the team stopped taking any risk. They stopped really driving towards the purpose and just started to deliver really iterations in a normal way. um, and not empowered. Over the next few months, there was a lot of cultural training that had to be done across both the teams and the client. And we had to actually rotate a lot of people to bring a new dynamic in there, and that basically got everything back on track. But it can just show how empowered teams and lack thereof, and you don't have a tangible metric to really work with it, can really cause a lot of friction.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was hearing kind of a vicious cycle in there as well, right? Like vicious cycle mixed with a bad use of metrics, right? We're trying to impose metrics to hold the team accountable when the team is using them to commit to, and when they're failing to commit that, we bring in the guardrails. We're holding them more accountable. So then, like, just this cascading effect inside of there with really just bad use of metrics in general. And which leads to a environment of distrust or low trust environments, right? And basically, what you were hitting at was how do we break out of a vicious cycle? How do we turn it into a virtuous cycle? What are the things that are inside the system that need to change? And the first piece of breaking out of that was we need to reset our expectations with leadership. We need to reevaluate how we're approaching conversations with the teams. Potentially reassess how we're using these metrics. What are we really trying to get out of them? What are the outcomes that we're really trying to shoot for? But so oftentimes in training, I think it's a great line, and we'll take it to Scrum here in just a second. Like, Scrum will do one of two things for you. Great, it's going to show you how to develop high quality software in 30 days or less, or it's going to show you why you can't. Right? That line, I use it pretty much in every class, and it's really to kind of pinpoint, like, so oftentimes in a classroom, a student will be saying, well, we can't do this because blah, 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 or it's not going to work here because blah, 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 or we're running into an issue because blah, blah, blah. Everything after the because are the things that you need to change, right? Those are the things that you need to change to break out of your vicious cycle that you've got going on right now. That's the hard part, but that's where the change is going to happen. I feel like that, like, we get stuck in the because too much. Like, we can't change this because, and then we're done. The conversation has died right there, right? And then maybe we'll go a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right to try to fix something that is within our control instead of addressing the because, which is essentially the big thing holding us back.
Yeah, another thing that I heard when you're telling that story was it sounded like we didn't have good conflict. And because of the psychological safety, it was more from a fear mentality. And so another thing I think you do have to have in organizational agility is you need to have deliberate action instead of this discouraged and avoided conflict. I don't know. Jeff and I are in the Midwest, and we have this Midwest nice thing. And like, we just, everything's got sugar on it. It's the nicest thing you could say to somebody, but like, get out of that meeting and then you hear some of the real comments, and it's that we should be having those real conversations all the time. And it's not personal. It's like, this is how we get better, and you should have the trust and faith in each other that we can improve and give each other feedback.
If you're not feeling empowered and you're not feeling safe to be able to have that conflict, I think I've met a few teams recently that have struggled with that. Like, I want to take this on, but I don't know how this will affect me, and I don't know how this will affect our team going forward. And culture takes a while to build, and in this case, it took a while to build in the wrong direction. It was 4 years of that eggshell model. Everyone's walking on eggshells, just trying to figure out, how to not upset someone. So that culture was built in moved to the wrong direction, to your point.
And I see that as a leadership problem. And I don't know where in leadership, but like, that's an environment that's been set up by leadership, the culture of, maybe not taking ownership of, and maybe they don't see it lived. I'm thinking of, I've just read this book by Jocko Wilkins. He's the guy who has extreme ownership, but he has a new book out. I forgot what the title is, but just read that book. And it's really about that leadership taking that ownership and saying, you know what, it's my fault then that, we can't have conflict because I didn't put you in a position to feel safe. How can I do that better? And like taking some ownership into that and figuring out what they need to do. Because without that, then how are you going to make decisions, right? Like, how are even the smallest things are going to derail us, right? If we can't handle conflict.
So in the spirit of like just agility and these 5 tenets that I mentioned earlier, couple of questions for you guys. One is based on people you've worked with, coaches, trainers. Is organizational agility just another silver bullet conversation that goes on today? Is that how are you feeling about that? Number one. And number two is, are these 5 tenets that we've talked about sufficient, necessary and sufficient in essence? Or are there others that, based on your experiences, you've also noticed should be in there? So the empowerment is one we've really honed in on. But are there others in your mind?
So it's interesting because so Chad Beyer and I did this talk recently about exercising your change muscle, and we unreeled our organizational agility manifesto, and we had 5 things in there too. And there are a lot of overlap, but there's some little differences. I'll just read it here for you. You can tell me what you think of it. One of the things that we wanted to stipulate really at the top of it was that, we're uncovering better ways of unlocking organizational agility by doing it and helping others do it. Very similar to the Agile Manifesto, where it talks about, we're learning by doing it. And that's exactly what happens here. So there's no copy paste going on when we're doing this. Every organization needs to figure out how they do this on their own. But in regards to roles, titles, skills, favor flexible and self-selected over specialized and assigned. So I always think of specialty as the enemy of agility. So if we are more robust, if we don't assign people to the things, if we let them select, there's going to be more of that motivation, more of that empowerment, more of that, that passion you were talking about. From a team standpoint, favor real teams over loosely aligned groups of individuals. Too often we go into organizations and it's really the DBA group, or it's the network group, or it's the XYZ group, right? And that's their identity. But for a real team, that's like a basketball team that's self-reliant on each other to score. Like everybody has to dribble, everybody has to pass, everybody plays defense. Some people are better at certain things than others, but everybody's got to play like that. We're not a golf team where everyone shoots their own round, we add up our scores at the end. So if real teams. From an information flow standpoint, favor transparent and rapid information flow over protected and slow. So a lot of organizations, some leaders, there's that bureaucracy of like, I'm going to own this and I have the information, then I can make better decisions. And then now I keep my position and justify my large paycheck. And so it's that rapid transparency, maybe not creating policies, but letting transparency solve that for you, things like that. And then decisions favor, decisions by the many over the few, which we kind of talked about already. And then conflict favoring deliberate action over discouraging and avoiding conflict. So, the radical transparency we definitely hit. The passion, I think we hit. I don't know if we hit the feedback loop as much. I'm hoping that happens with, I guess, the
team. The third piece was the iterative feedback loop. And I think the piece that I love your point on the bias to action, right? So that whole, moving to an action model, actionable sort of mindset, because part of the organizational agility is driving momentum as well. And sometimes you can do all of those things, have a clear backbone, but if you're not driving momentum, you're not taking people along.
And I think that is tied right in with empowered teams. Like you would hope that when people feel empowered, they're empowered to take action, right? And I think that the converse of that is a lot of organizations that I've worked with in the past is people who weren't empowered didn't bother taking actions. Like, what would it matter? I'll just be told what to do. So I think that's a byproduct. One of the pieces of feedback that, just from my perspective, and maybe this is implicit because Jeff, yours was more for organizational agility. Well, I guess Maneesh, yours was as well. But Maneesh, you had backbone in there. Your core value, what I would say is common purpose. And maybe that's implicit in what we think of as in organizations. Like I can't think of an organization that wouldn't have a vision, that wouldn't have a purpose, but maybe it's not there. And I feel like that would be the one piece from Jeff that I feel like is missing there is just common purpose. However you would articulate that, because I feel like you can do all of these things, but if you're doing them on all the different directions, then who cares, right? And this goes back to like I constantly have this conversation in my head in a positive way with like if because Jeff and I don't have as many opportunities to talk as we used to, but like business agility and good product development, I feel like are peanut butter and jelly, right? Like I go back and forth like, well, which one of those is truly more important, to have an agile organization or a good product organization? And I don't think it's necessarily binary, but I would say there's a lot of unagile organizations out there today that are doing just fine, because they have strong, powerful products in the market. Now that's likely going to be disrupted and changed pretty quick here. But conversely, if we had a really crummy product or no good product direction, would anybody care how agile our organization is? I think the feedback on that is, through having a powerful or a more agile organization, we're going to get to a good product quicker, and we are more likely to succeed in that direction.
And that's the backbone. To me, that's the common purpose of the backbone right there. I think one of the things with organizational agility that and then you hit both actually, is things I see that are really hard with large organizations. One is the funding model, the business agility. I worked with an organization recently that is thinking about a funding process now for something that is going to be funded potentially next year or maybe middle of next year, which is very, very far away because the market's just changing so quickly at this point.
Yeah, especially right now.
Right now.
It's really weird, right. But hey, that's the way it is.
Yeah. And then the second piece is that project mindset and not thinking about products, as we had talked also the last time, but you're funding in these tranches as opposed to funding the big picture, which is you have purpose, because the purpose is fairly myopic at the project level. It's short, 2-3 months, as opposed to an evolution of a product. And that then creates a bunch of challenges and optimization constraints with organizations. To your point on the real teams, that real team doesn't happen because you finish projects and you move on to the next thing.
Yeah,
which you tend to see a lot. So in terms of my second question, is organizational agility a misnomer? Is that something that is it a real thing, or is it just going through a point in time of it's going through its 15 minutes of fame?
Who knows what's going to happen with the way things are said. I think the premises behind it, the principles behind it will stick. We might use different words and terminology, but there will always be like, hey, if we can deliver faster and learn faster, that's going to be a good thing. Hey, if we can get everybody involved and get everybody's creativity involved in solving the problem, we're probably going to solve problems better. Hey, if we can learn fast, get the information out to everybody, we're gonna make better decisions. That's gonna be a good thing, right? Like if we can harness the power of a team, that's probably gonna be a good thing, right? And deliver to our customers and, have this focus on them. So I think all the premises of organizational agility, I don't know. I think they're there to stay. Whether we call it that, I don't know. I hope so. I mean, it's better than agile became this overloaded word, and maybe organizational agility will become an overloaded word too. I'm not sure, but I think what it stands for, what it's meant to be, has really good premises behind it. What are your thoughts?
So I was going to throw out real quick. Daryl Bigsby had thrown this out in his book, and I feel like he used a good analogy, like the pendulum swinging, right? And I think a lot of places it's gone a little bit too far with the agile for everything. Now, we were talking about different contexts earlier, right? Like the farm and cattle and all that. That's great,
yeah,
where it's applicable. But I think part of there's a number of potholes or landmines that I think organizations step through, but one of them is make everything agile. Everything is going to be agile, right? And to your silver bullet analogy, that's not what it is. Agile has a great place in a lot of domains, but not every domain. And trying to make every domain agile isn't necessarily going to give you the expected outcome that you're shooting for. So I feel like that pendulum swung a little bit too far, and it might be recentering itself right now. At least that's my 2 cents on it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with you both. I think for me, organizational agility is a mindset for an organization to learn, evolve as quickly as possible, and not stick with any way of working. So in 5 years from now, an organization should be different from what it was, because more so now than ever before, because there's so much uncertainty and volatility in the market, right? So continuing to be that learning organization and being able to move based on a potential oil discovery and run with it, right, is really critical. And there are many times when I remember a coach saying this, an agile coach saying this a few years ago to me. The way I figure out if an organization is agile is I'll go walk the floor and ask someone about the ideas they have on their board. And that's not on their backlog, but it's like one of their ideas they want to achieve over the next few months or whatever, an innovation idea. How fast will you be able to take that innovation idea out to market? And generally, for most organizations, that 3, 6, 12-month run on a really small innovation is a smell of, the nimbleness of that organization at scale. And which I thought was a fascinating way to really think about the symptom and the root cause. But for organizations to be able to reduce that cycle time as quickly as possible, I think is critical to really drive that organizational agility and stay nimble.
Yeah, you made me think of this quote that I heard recently where it was a product person and they were talking about how, but the best kind of products are the ones that I have and no one else does. And they have, customers have to buy my product if they want it, if they want this thing that solves this problem.
Right.
And that's responding to those needs really fast, right? So I think that premise of organizational agility, like I don't see the world slowing down anytime in the future. And I don't see the pace of change slowing down at any time in the near future. I think it's only going to get faster and probably exponentially faster. And so that's going to be important. And what we call that, how we respond to that and the principles and practices we use will definitely change. Well, the practices will change. The principles hopefully will probably stay the same is what I'm thinking.
I think we've walked through a lot of different stories together, which has been fantastic, from cattle to banks to consulting firms.
Yeah, thanks again for coming back on and sharing all your knowledge with us, Maneesh. We learned a lot. It was great to hear those stories, and we'll do it again when we have some more stories to share. So,
we're going to get you back on here after you change that funding model, and you're going to tell us how you did it.
That's my next goal, my next hope. But thank you so much. It's really been great to be on again, and it's been a fascinating conversation again. I'm glad we went deep on some real topics there, which was great.
Awesome. Okay.